everyone. We are back today for another installment of Janus Academy's courses, Historical Analogies. This will be an episode dedicated to Baroque and Fauvism. So we can say that this is a very interesting one. There's a lot of similarities. There are some key differences that we're going to want to address. And we should like to start with the background of both of these particular styles, but both of these eras. The background is really interesting to compare. To begin with, we can say that the background has a lot to do with two different forms of capitalism that we've already mentioned before. And again, we'll mention it again. This is something we'll often return to. So we have this difference between mercantile capitalism on one end and industrial capitalism on the other. Now, in particular, we are dealing with the fact that Baroque came as an elaboration of Renaissance on one end, Mannerism on the other. It came as a development of these two particular styles, but more importantly, we need to understand why Baroque was created. So it was not a spontaneous development, and it was not necessarily a result of historical circumstances like it was with the Renaissance, that the Black Plague happened, that the fall of Constantinople happened, many other things that came together. Baroque was perhaps more than any other style created with a specific intent. And the intent in mind was a response to Protestantism. So what happened mostly in the north of Europe was that this region of the world started moving away from Catholicism. They started developing their own version of Christian religion that was called Protestantism, because they were protesting against many aspects of the Catholic Church. Now, this is a whole lecture unto itself, not to say a series of lectures. We're not going to get into all of that. We're just going to focus on aesthetics and the spiritual background of this conflict, because it is most important for us if we want to properly understand Baroque, and then if we want to properly understand its analogy to Fauvism. So what happens is that church, for a very long period of time, including the medieval period as well as the Renaissance, is trying to communicate its message mostly to people who are not necessarily completely involved. So we still have a lot of paganism happening in Europe. And this is a thing, again, that we may constantly go back to, the fact that Europe was only fully Christianized in the 16th century. And as you can imagine, spreading of Christianity had its own geographical pattern. It had its own geographical logic. Of course, it would go from Rome on one end, and it would go from Constantinople on the other. So we can assume and point out that Christianity came from the south and went up towards the north. So the northern parts of Europe, meaning Baltic countries, were the last one to get fully Christianized in the 16th century. Now, what the church had to deal with during this period was the fact that a lot of the people did not speak the language. The church insisted on using Latin. So the church didn't have the power to impose itself upon these people. They needed to attract them, and this is why they started creating very elaborate churches. This is how Gothic style became what it was. They continued doing that in the Renaissance period. The churches were as elaborate, as glorious, as magnificent, only of course done in a completely different aesthetic. So what happens, what makes Protestantism possible was basically the Gutenberg's revolution, the invention of the printing press, which made the books much more available and which incited people to become more literate so that they could read the Bible themselves. This means that now people do not have to go to the church. They do not have to have the Bible explained, interpreted to them by the church officials. They can create a personal relationship with the whole thing. They can speak to God, so it were themselves. They don't need to go through the mediator. They don't need to go through the priest or the entire institution of the church. And as you can imagine, the Catholic Church is not very happy about this. So they want to maintain whatever kind of monopoly they have over culture, over spirituality, over a lot of economy. We all know that these things tend to be connected. So the Catholic Church revolts against this. Now, you can do a simple experiment to this day. If you have a Protestant church near to you, you can go there. And then after that, you can go and you can visit a Catholic church. And regardless of the style in which the Catholic Church is made, it can be Gothic Revival, it can be Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, Mannerist, Rococo, classical, neoclassical. It doesn't really matter. They're always going to be very ornate. If it's a Catholic church, you will see that they ornate as much as they possibly can. So they're trying to bring about this idea of heaven on earth. They're trying to make it as pretty, as aesthetic, as attractive as humanly possible. On the other end, you go to a Protestant church and you understand that they're very, very reduced, minimalist. One could argue even barren. And this is done with a very specific intent. So Protestantism seeks to go back to Christianity in its initial form. In this regard, it's fairly comparable to Orthodoxy, but also, of course, very different because Orthodox people do use images, unlike the Protestants. So if you go to a Protestant church, you will likely see no images. You will see no paintings, no statues. You will not see any stained glass windows except for Presbyterians who do use them, but only with abstract patterns. They don't use representative imagery. So this is really important. Protestantism is, in most its variations, in most its different branches, not to say schisms, very much anti-image use. It's very much anti-idolatry. And they think that Catholics are fairly blasphemous because they rely so much on images. The images are very, very important. Now, when this moment starts happening, it takes over the north of Europe by storm. It spreads very quickly because you could argue that north of Europe has a lifestyle, has climate, has many different circumstances that are very beneficial to this particular theology, to this particular dogma, and the lifestyle it demands. So you could argue, and many people have, that Protestantism really is a religious and spiritual elaboration and formulation of a bourgeois mercantile way of life. So you could say that this connection is by no means my invention, or was I the first to spot this. So we have a very famous scholar called Max Weber who wrote a very famous study on the connection between capitalism and Protestantism. So I suggest you find this book. It's not terribly long. It's incredibly dense with info. It's very, very interesting because Weber was a sociologist. He especially dealt with religion. He wrote a lot of studies on how religions communicate with different people, with different geographies, and especially with different economic models. And I think this is possibly one of his most famous works. So he studied this analysis, he studied this connection between Protestantism and capitalism, and truly there are a lot of connections. Now, I could say that personally I don't necessarily fully agree with Weber, because I think he puts the carriage in front of the horse, so as to say that he thinks that capitalism grew out of Protestantism. I would personally argue that it was the other way around. But let's say that it doesn't really matter. It really kind of depends if you want to approach it from the idealistic or materialistic side. So I personally think that materialistic side has a better argument, that this was the formulation of a certain type of economy that happened, and not the type of economy that grew out of the idea, out of dogma. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. What truly matters is that these two things, Protestantism and capitalism, are very closely connected. And what also matters is that we start talking about Protestantism in the 15th and 16th century, which are, by no coincidence, centuries where we have the growth, explosion, and indeed very powerful formulation of mercantile capitalism. So we can say that this type of economic model influences all of the domains of human life. It changes how we see things. It changes how we see the world, how we see ourselves. So we can also talk about this particular conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism in terms of aesthetics, which means that this would be an invention of the Baroque style that was specifically meant to rival and contrast austerity of Protestantism. So we could also say that it has a very important economic model. It's a conflict of two economic models, because church is very much in favor of feudalistic aristocracy. So they are not quite as much in favor of mercantile capitalist bourgeois people. So we can say that gradually, of course, church gets to accept this model as well. The church gets to integrate it, but initially church is very much with monarchy, it's very much with aristocracy, and it's very much with this particular worldview. Now, we can say that this Protestant austerity is something that is very challenging to Baroque. It's very challenging to the church. This is why the church decides to double down. So they find themselves being criticized for their opulence, for kitsch, for usage of special effects, bells and whistles. They find themselves accused of idolatry, of wanton usage of images, and so their natural reaction is to double down. They want to go twice as hard at usage of imagery, of everything that is carnal, everything that is corporal, drama of the senses. So they create Baroque style that is basically all of these things as present as possible. Instead of listening to criticism, they see this eventuality as a sign of weakness. They decide to go in their own direction twice as hard. So this is how we get to this particular reaction. You could argue that what happens then in the late 19th century when we're speaking about Fauvism is very comparable, and the thread that makes it so comparable for all is the economic model and the influence of the economic model to the rest of the society. So what we have in the late 19th century is the full industrialization of society. We have industrial revolution at full swing, and we have people reacting to this. So people reacting to this in different manners. Now you could argue that this whole idea of industry was driven by science, by scientific discoveries, by scientific method. And we already talked about this when we spoke about pointillism in previous episodes, and to a certain extent when we spoke about impressionism. These are all connected because they happen at the same time. And these are all aligned in a way that you could say that pointillism and divisionism grow out of impressionism the same way that Fauvism grows out of pointillism, divisionism, and more importantly, symbolism. So you could say that they are all reacting to the same impulse. Now, the difference is considerable between how pointillists react on the Industrial Revolution and how the Fauvists react on the Industrial Revolution. You could say that amongst this entire overwhelming influence of industrialized society on human psyche, on the machines, of presence of machines all over the place, people react in two different ways. One is affirmative. One is that they start to see themselves as machines. This is what we already addressed with pointillism. So we start to see ourselves as organic machines. We completely conform ourselves to this newfound situation in the world, and we start embracing and integrating this machine-like worldview. Now, on the other end, we have opposition to this. We have the completely different reactions. So we are trying to resist this. We are trying to fight this, and we don't want to become mechanized. We want to remain human. So we want to emphasize everything that is human, and we want to go back to how we see humanity being before the Industrial Revolution. So this is what happens with Fauvism. So Fauvism takes a completely different approach than pointillism and divisionism do, because it wants to reaffirm what is really human. Now, of course, this is the million-dollar question, what is really human? It really largely depends how you see it. There's not one answer to this question. There are infinite answers, but we can stay with this particular context and we can see how these people define it. So we are finding this interesting that Protestantism, back in the day when it emerges, brings about this very sober worldviews, very minimalist, very austere. So it's all about labor and it's all about work and effort. So this is the take on Christianity that is very focalized on frugality. And if you travel through north of Europe, you can see this. You can see that their houses are quite small. They don't come as ornate as south of Europe houses. Their churches are different. Everything is different. So you really have a much more austere way of life, which you can interpret by their climate, if you are so inclined, or you can interpret, again, by Protestantism, depending which influence you think is more important. You could also say that they all come together. So the whole point is that we have this focus on what is spiritual and not on what is carnal. We have this focus on what is intellectual, what is cerebral. People focus on numbers. We can say that the dominant economic model, again, is mercantile capitalism. So what do you do if you partake in mercantile capitalism? In most cases, you deal with trade. So you deal with import, export, you mostly deal with numbers. And this is what becomes really important to you. So the way you deal with numbers develops a certain part of your personality, not to say the certain type of your mind. and you start looking at the world through this particular lens. So everything becomes a question of numbers. And you could argue that you weigh in heavily on this aspect of spirit. You don't necessarily think that much about the body, because if you go to north of Europe, let's say Holland, you understand that your body is very miserable in that particular environment throughout most of the year. I sadly speak from experience. So yeah, you focus your attention elsewhere. And this in turn produces the entire way in which you see the world, and it influences your art, it influences ultimately your religion, and with this, everything else, how you live. So you could say that this is the main impetus behind both Protestantism and mercantile capitalism, and this is what Baroque is trying to fight. On the other end, we have Fauvism fighting a very similar thing, because in their mind, they're opposing what they see as organic, natural, raw, fundamentally human, what means also very animalistic. So they oppose this to a very conceptual, very cerebral, very scientific and academic, not only neoclassicism, which is still the dominant artistic and stylistic formation of that era, but also to pointillism, because pointillism and divisionism, although they come as a part of the although they come as a part of the avant-garde movement and they are questioning neoclassicism on their own end, they still do it from a very cerebral point of view. So Fauvism is an interesting thing to discuss here because it obviously grows out of pointillism and divisionism. I should take a moment and describe the difference, because we're going to be using them almost simultaneously and almost synonymous, but they're not quite that. So we could say that divisionism is really the method of dividing colors using the, simple colors that are placed next to one another so as to produce effect of light if you see the painting from afar. Whereas pointillism is really just drawing in dots, painting in dots. Now, you could say that the two are to a certain extent interchangeable, but not quite. So I speak broadly of both as pointillism in most cases. Though we can see that some divisionist paintings are not done in dots, they're done in brush strokes that are more or less dot-like. So we can see that this is not entirely the same, but it comes as a part of a very similar impulse. And we can argue that it's really interesting to see that Fauvism directly grows out of both of these. We see this in the method of Matisse, most importantly, and we see how Matisse is organically reacting against this method and against everything that it stands for. You could say that part of the protest that people that created Baroque invested against Protestantism, nascent and growing Protestantism, was this particular idea of hierarchy. And this particular idea of divine glory that has a lot to do with both social and spiritual verticality. So Protestantism is very much against this. They are very much against the whole papist hierarchy of the church. In Protestant churches, Pope is not recognized as authority. And if you look at the Catholic Church, the way it's organized, it truly has a structure of the army. You have ranks, you have levels. It's a very strongly hierarchical organization. Whereas Protestants in most cases feel that hierarchies are completely unnecessary because, again, you don't need a whole army-like structure to be the intermediary between yourself and divinity. You can get into personal, individual contact with God. And this is the big difference to be addressed. So there is this idea that wherever you have hierarchy and you have verticality, you have a powerful institution, you also have the notions of glory, also of fame, of importance. You have elevation. So this comes in terms of luxury, wealth, status, all these things that you don't necessarily have when you are acting as an individual and when all of your effort is individualistic in nature. So you have this difference to address as well. And you have as a fact that Fauvism also to a certain extent is interested in the difference between institutions and individuals. But we're going to come back to that later. So you could argue that on one end we have intellectualization of society that happens with Protestantism, which happens with books becoming more broadly available. A lot of more people are enticed to become literate, to read, to educate themselves. Education is no longer quite strongly as controlled by the church as it was before. So this is what happens, growing rates of literacy, growing intellectualization of society and of culture and arts and of religion. On the other end, we have this whole idea of industrial capitalism producing the very same effect. So we have the Industrial Revolution, which means that we have obligatory elementary education, that we have, again, growing rates of literacy, that we have education becoming more and more available, if not, for nothing else, then because we need a fairly educated workforce. If you want to work in a factory, you have to have some sort of understanding of machines. To acquire that, you have to have some sort of education. You have to go to school, at least in a basic format. And also, we have this whole idea that appears with the Industrial and French Revolution, the idea of a nation state, which means that all of the state exists in one singular language, that everyone follows the same law, everyone followed the same law, the same set of laws, and that we are unified in this manner, in which we were never unified before. We had states that practiced many different languages, not to speak of dialects and local expressions. We had a very famous linguist, Noam Chomsky, arguing that in France, people who lived in France in the 18th century and even the late 18th century, people who lived 5 kilometers apart could not understand one another. They spoke completely different, not languages, it's all a French language, but forms of French language. So in French Revolution and the society that came afterwards tried to unify all of this. They tried to make one singular language that's understandable for everyone, and this is why they've forced, well, strange wording, but this is why they imposed elementary education, so as to assure that everyone speaks the same language. The language will be taught at school. Now, this, of course, arguably is a very useful affair. You want a state where people use more or less the same language. It's much more practical, it's easier. But on the other end, it means extinction of many interesting local varieties of that language. It means a cultural genocide to a certain extent, and it means that you have a more functional but less interesting society. So this is exactly what Fauvists are trying to fight. They're trying to fight this whole idea that everything that is unique and individual and peculiar and weird is being basically put to death, that's being intentionally made extinct, because we want to have this industrial, functional, optimal, performative, productive civilization. And they make a comparison the same way that Baroque people were invested in glory of God, and they wanted to show the glory of God. They wanted to show the beauty of vertical hierarchy of the church and wonders and splendors it can produce. They wanted that type of world to live, and they were forced with this very cold, calculated, intellectual, cerebral, austere, and frugal take on things, which was Protestantism. So we can say that these two are fairly similar, not only visually, but also in terms of how they react to their society. So you could say that Baroque was reacting to excessive intellectualization of society, bringing forth the glory of God that is a meta-reasonal, supra-reasonal affair, whereas Fauvists were reacting to machine desolation of society, to extinction of these local varieties of not only language, but also customs, cultural, rituals, all these things. So this was their reaction. They were fighting against it. And you can see this in most of 19th and 20th century art, that people either embrace the industrial process or they're bitterly fighting against it. So we'll mention this many more times when you're discussing 19th and 20th century art. Now, this is a very important thing to address. Baroque seeks to reconnect individual with God. It seeks to reinstall divinity, to bring back divinity in full power, and to show in the most concrete and visual manner how powerful divinity truly is. So the glory of God is something we'll mention a lot during the rest of this presentation. On the other end, we have this whole idea of Fauvism, for man trying to, person rather, is trying to reconnect with themselves. So they're trying to protect and preserve and to a certain extent rediscover their humanity. So you could say that Baroque was an intent to rediscover and reaffirm our connection with God, and Fauvism was this attempt to rediscover and preserve our connection with ourselves. Because again, humanity was seen as endangered by industrialization, by mechanization of society, and by extinction of all of the cultural varieties that were present up until that moment. Now, I think there's a very good connection between the two, because if you think about the Christian paradigm in which we are presenting this, because both Baroque and Fauvism happen in Christian paradigms, we are truly talking about this assumption, the very basic assumption of all of the Christian denominations, that God made human out of himself. Now, if you go back to the Bible again, the book of Genesis, you see that God created the man and then a woman as a pinnacle of all creation. So he creates humans at the very end of the creative cycle, and he exhausts himself in doing so. Or exhaust themselves, not the gender God, right? So we have this idea that even God, who is an almighty creator, who created the universe and everything in it, exhausts himself while he creates humans. Now, he didn't, or they didn't exhaust themselves as they created the whole of universe, planets, stars, and everything else in it when they were creating animals, etc. But they did so when they created human. And I would like to invoke this very fundamental aspect of a creative process. If we are creating anything and we take a certain amount of time, we take a certain amount of effort and persistence in doing so, we have spent that time basically infusing ourselves into the object which we were creating. And so I think a very good analogy with this is how the Freemasons see stones and how they deal with stone. The full title, by the way, is the Free Stone Mason. So if you are a stonemason back in the medieval period, not to speak of the semi-secret or secret organization, that's a whole other thing, but if you're a stonemason back in medieval Europe, and let's say that you're building a Gothic cathedral, as many of them have, you spend a lot of time working on the stone. And you have stone that begins in a very crude form. So you have to polish it, you have to work on it, you have to basically infuse it with your own soul. You have to infuse this piece of stone with intelligence, with diligence, with labor. And after a while, this stone becomes a part of a much larger whole. It becomes a part of the cathedral, where this stone is truly liberated from the confines of the physical and material world. This stone is made to defy gravity, to hover, which is the impression you have when you enter the Gothic cathedral and you see the stone ceiling. You feel as if it's carried by volumes of light. Now, speaking about this from the constructor's point of view, from a stonemason's point of view, you as a human being, you have intelligence, you have spirit, you have will. Stones have none of this. Stones are very basic material entities. So you infuse this stone with all of the qualities that you have. So infuse this stone with beauty, with elegance, with style, with intelligence, with rigor, with structure, all these other things. So basically, what is present in your spirit becomes present in stone. And this is the same way in which you can look at creation of humanity by God. So God infuses themselves into, well, basically earth, if we're going to go by the Bible, out of which humans are created. And so God does this so intensely that they get exhausted. So they have to rest after this creation. And this means that whenever we are whenever we are trying to rediscover ourselves, we are truly following this analogy, trying to rediscover God. Because human soul really is divine. Human soul comes from God. I mean, this is what the Bible says. So the whole idea is that what the Baroque is doing, trying to reconnect with God, and what Fauvism is doing, trying to reconnect humanity with itself, is one and the same thing. Or at the very least, it's extremely similar. You understand the logic and you understand the analogy. So we can go for it. The idea is that the way we see divinity and the way we see humanity is very comparable in these two styles. So when Baroque is seeking the glory of God, they are doing it in the most dramatic manner. You could argue that medieval period is all about the glory of God, and so is the Renaissance, and so, in its twisted way, is Mannerism. It's, however, quite different when it comes to Baroque, because Baroque represents a lot of drama, a lot of passion, a lot of pathos. So this all has very, very clear visual implications. When you're looking at a Baroque painting, you see a lot of very strongly contrasted lights. You see a light and shadow, clashing it out. So you see overly exaggerated bodies, incredibly muscular human beings, be they women or men. We see, let's say, very thick and round women in a very exacerbated manner. So let's say it's a famous example that Rubens liked his characters to be overly muscular and overly fat at the same time. So they were really concentrated human presence that had very little to do with Renaissance ideas of style and elegance and harmony. No, this is humanity that is exploding off itself. So if you're looking at Baroque compositions, you can see that they're twisted, they're intentionally using empty spaces, they're intentionally using irregularities. It's all there to heighten drama and to heighten pathos. And this is how we see glory of God. We don't see it as Renaissance harmony. We don't see it necessarily as medieval transcendence. No, we see it as incredibly sensual, corporal, and heightened emotion. So truly, these are some of the most dramatic paintings that were ever made. And we'll give some examples as we go for it. So you can see a very similar thing in Fauvism. Very similar, if not exactly the same. Now, Fauvist paintings appear as quite simple because they are flat and because they have an intentionally reduced color palette. So we have this whole notion of vibrancy and energy, an energetical field of a color that communicates with the other color in very strong contrast. Now this is where we approach Baroque, and this is where you can say there's a direct connection. Because what you want to do when you're a Fauvist artist is first, you want to focus on what this painting is all about. Truly, you are not depicting a person, let's say, or a scene, it doesn't matter, in all of the details that can be depicted. This is a waste of time, and it's a completely different effort. We already argued, talking about Impressionism, that photography annuls all of this. There's no interest in depicting photorealistic or even realistic paintings. We are going in a completely different direction. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to get to the very essence of the object. When we are representing a human being, we are not looking at all the pores and all of the dandruff and all of the particular hairs they have, all of the details. We're not looking at that. That's a waste of time. We are looking at the soul of a person. We are trying to bring their very essence out to the surface. So we are trying to synthesize and distill in a way what that person really is. And this is what we are interested in. Now, the way to achieve this is not to accumulate and pile up all of the details. Everything we see, we think that eye is cluttered with all of these things. So we want to take those things away, and we want to focus on what is truly human. And this is what gets us to the comparison with Baroque, because when we talk about what is truly human, we go back to the same ideas, that humanity is all in drama, in effort, in pain, in contortion, in pathos. So we see paintings that present either a very sensual image, a very sensual scene, or we see incredibly vibrant colors. We see a drama of existence as such. And this is what is so comparable to Baroque. Now you could say that Baroque tends to exhaust itself in details, whereas Fauvism tends to be as simple as possible. Though I would argue that both aim at very poignant expression, they both aim at heightened drama, they're just going about it in different directions. However, not all of these directions are different, because if you're thinking about colors, they are very comparable. Baroque also seeks strong colors, especially when it comes to light. If we're talking about light, it is extremely comparable. Treatment of light is very similar in these two styles. So the treatment of light, again, has obviously its spiritual aspects. We addressed this when we talked about Gothic, when we talked about Impressionism. Light, of course, has its very, very strong meaning and representation. And we can say the same thing here, because light in Baroque, as we all know, it becomes a much more complicated affair than is the case in Renaissance. Renaissance is still much closer to Orthodox icon, where light is presented in a very peculiar manner. We get to full embracing of shadows in Baroque style. We have this whole play of light and darkness, chiaroscuro. So we have this driven to the very dramatic effect. And you can say a very similar thing about light in Fauvism, that while we don't have that many shadows in Fauvism, we do have the drama of the light, and we do give a light a very, very peculiar very carnal and very sensual quality. And this is how we can compare these two styles, because Baroque is most sensual. And again, it is done that way so as to directly oppose austerity of Protestantism. So they want to represent not only glory of God, but glory of God incarnate, present in this realm of existence, and presented, given to us through carnal means. So this is basically the criticism they were facing, that they were communicating their religion in an entirely too carnal of a manner, which is something you can say about Gothic style, about Renaissance, about Mannerism, and of course you can say that about Baroque. So it is entirely carnal. And you can say the same thing about Fauvism. Now, carnality is an incredibly important aspect of Fauvism, because it comes not only as a criticism of the industrial process and mechanization of society, which is seen as sterile and rhythmical and order and entirely anti-human, but it also comes as a criticism of mores, of its society, of morals, of something that we today like to refer to as a Victorian society. This idea that everyone should be covered, everyone should wear very restrictive clothing, women should wear corsets, they should not be able to breathe or move properly, female sexuality is a major taboo that essentially should not exist. A decent woman should never enjoy sex, she should never think about sex. Everything is to be very, very clean and very sterile and very asexual. So this is basically one of the ways in which we react to this particular attitude. It's interesting to say that in this particular period, we had more brothels and prostitutes per capita than we ever had in our history. So this is the other side of this particular societal malady, that you're trying to force all of sensuality, all of carnality, all of sexuality out of all society. So we have this Fauvist attempt to be very much carnal and very much atavistic. Now, why do I say this? Well, because they want to connect themselves with the animal world. There is this whole idea that what defines humanity is spirit, is intelligence, all of the other solar qualities. And what defines the animal world on the other end is something that is in the Chthonian realm. So animals are carnal, they're sexual, they exist in the realm of matter, they follow their blind impulses, etc. Now, I just need to say that scientifically speaking, this is incredibly wrong. Most animals are way less interested in sex than humans are, so they have mating seasons. And while there are higher function primates, like some apes, bonobo apes famously, or dolphins that do practice sex more often in the year, and they don't necessarily follow the rhythms of the mating cycle, most animals do. It's really only humans and a couple of other species that tend to practice sex outside of a mating cycle. So this whole idea that animalistic atavism is sexual and that sex is atavistic has no foundation in reality, but still we thought about it this way for thousands of years. And this is how it's presented to this particular crowd. Back in the turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th, these people were called fauves because this is the appellation of a wild animal to begin with. So the first exposition they gave was pejoratively labeled in a derogatory manner as fauvistic, which meant as if it was in the realm of wild animals. So it's this whole idea that these people then embraced this appellation and said, yes, we are atavistic, we are like wild animals, we don't care about your cold abstractions, we want things to be carnal, we want them sensual, and we want them warm and flavorful and all of these other things. So it's interesting to draw another analogy, speaking of birth of Fauvism, to draw yet another analogy and similarity with Baroque, because you could say that we were talking about Renaissance on one end and Mannerism on the other, and then Baroque that came after both of these. So we could say that Renaissance was the mainstream, Mannerism was a side stream or a sideline, and then Baroque came as an elaboration, as a sort of a reaction that bridged these two and that synthesized these two, brought them together. So you could say that the same thing is true when it comes to Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism being one development that is mainstream. Then we had Symbolism that happened on the other end that was kind of a sidetrack. And then we had Fauvism growing more out of symbolism than it did out of Neo-Impressionism. Though if you look at early Fauvist paintings, you can clearly see them growing out of pointillism and divisionism, Neo-Impressionism, if you will. So you can see them being done with dots. And this is a very clear example. So if you're looking at Matisse's paintings, we're going to be talking about one in particular that I think is really important and that encapsulates the whole thing perfectly. If you're looking at Duran paintings, you can see the obvious influence of pointillism and divisionism. So it's this whole idea that aesthetically speaking, they grow out of pointillism and divisionism, but fundamentally, thematically speaking, they grow out of symbolism more. And no one represents this better than Gauguin. So you could say that Gauguin begins as a symbolist painter, and he really develops his style in this particular manner, thematically and visually, but then he grows into being one of the originators of Fauvism. So this is a very important bridge between these styles. And when we are looking at Gauguin's paintings, we're looking at very warm, saturated colors. We are looking at them being sensual, but in a very specific manner. This sensuality is very Orientalist, very colonial, but it's also given to us as very primitivist and extremely atavistic. So he is the one who be fascinated with people of color, and in the most racist manner, which was, the spirit of that time, assume that these people are far more sensual than Caucasian white people. So it's this division that exists in this particular time that many people follow, many poets and many painters. This division that exists between Europe on one end and the Orient on the other. Orientalism, of course, is a major driving force behind this. So there is this famous poem that is written by Baudelaire, again with Baudelaire, that's called Invitation au voyage, and that speaks about this whole necessity to leave Europe. Europe is boring, it's drab, it's riddled with laws, there's no more fun there, there's nothing to do. All of the things we addressed when we talked about spleen and when we talked about that particular context, well, this is a part of the same story. So the only thing we can do is travel. So I'll just give you a couple of verses. I'm not going to quote the whole thing, and I'm going to read it as it is in French. So it says, Les riches plafonds, les miroirs profonds, la splendeur orientale. Tout y parlerait à l'âme en secret sa douce langue natale. Là, toutes n'est qu'ordre et beauté, luxe, calme et volupté. So why did I choose these verses and not the whole poem? Well, the thing is that we have this idea of the rich ceilings, the profound, deep mirrors, and Oriental splendor. This is basically why I chose to quote this. It's the Oriental splendor. Now, Oriental in this case means luxurious, luminous. It means sensual, erotic, etc. So this is obviously a dichotomy to European sternness and frugality and hard work ethic and all of the other Protestant capitalistic affairs. Now, this is where we get to the interesting point. À l'âme en secret, sa douce langue natale. So he's suggesting, Baudelaire, that all of this sensual, primitive, atavistic, and erotic context is our langue natale. It's our maternal language. We are born into this. This is our true nature. And this is what they're trying to discover or rediscover or re-actualize. This is what the Fauvists are trying to bring back. This carnal existence and this carnal painting is who we truly are. So they see what pointillists are doing and what Neo-Impressionism is all about is this vain scientific abstraction, this cerebral masturbation, if you will allow it, as very foreign to humanity. What humanity truly is all about is sensual pleasure, sensual delight. They see this as our maternal language, our sweet maternal language, douce langue natale. And then we get to the famous refrain of this little poem. So it says, Là, toutes n'est qu'ordre et beauté, luxe, calme et volupté. You'll have to excuse my French pronunciation for the moment. So there, talking about the Oriental period, everything is nothing but order and beauty. Luxury, calmness, and volupté is kind of tricky to translate. It's basically sensual delight. Let's put it that. Voluptuous is an adjective. You know what that means. So basically sensual delight. And this imaginary country that he is talking about, or this realm rather than a country, is exactly like that. It's the realm of eternal summer, where everyone walks around naked. It's basically the paradisical idea of, well, the Garden of Eden, but for people are very, very sensual and very animalistic in this regard. Now, why am I quoting this poem? Well, one of the major reasons is that painting that is named after this poem is called Lux, Calme et Volupté. It's done by Matisse. It was presented in Musée d'Orsay a while ago, a couple of decades ago. Then it was acquired by Musée Pompidou, which is where you can see it to this day. And it's basically one of the fundamental moments of early Fauvism. So it's one of the pillars of Fauvism. So when you look at this painting, of course, you will see it on the screen. You can see that it's very, very pointillist in nature. So it was done in divisionist style, but it's already turning its attention away from this idea of scientific experiment and dealing with light and trying to figure out how we see things and what is the mechanism of our eye and how it connects with light. Is light a particle or a wave? All these things, he places them aside and he launches himself headfirst into this context of luxury, seen in a very peculiar manner, right? Lux, we said, comes from light. Lux is light in Latin. Warm colors, the sea. And this whole idea of eternal vacation, this imaginary realm where we don't have to work, when there's no obligations, there's no labor, there's nothing but order and beauty that just spontaneously exist. And sure enough, if you were a Western European who was into colonizing the rest of the world, and if you got to go to one of the colonies, you could possibly have a life that's very close to that if you were able to ignore all the misery and exploitation that was happening around you. But let's say that the fantasy existed, it was very prevalent, and it was very influential. So the whole idea, to go back to Baroque, because this whole thing is an analogy between Baroque and Fauvism, was that Baroque artists and the church behind them were very busy at work to show that you had this austere, miserable, barren dogma that was Protestantism and their ugly churches, right? So on the other end, you had the land of plenty, the land of luxury, beauty, lux, calme et volupté. Well, if you just take the calm out of this, because there's nothing calm about Baroque, lux, volupté, beauté, like these are all present, and they're present to the nth degree. So Baroque is very, very busy and incredibly aggressive, I would even add, at achieving these, into imposing this whole idea of glory of God upon you. Now, I want to go back to this whole idea of drama, carnal drama for all, drama of the senses, that is presented to us in very, very clear visual terms. So I want to give a couple of examples from these two worlds, from these two different eras that, although different, are very similar, as we are discovering. So I want to say a couple of words about a couple of important authors in the Baroque era. So we can say a couple of words about Carracci, about Caravaggio, about Artemisia Gentileschi, a very interesting example. I would put aside for the moment Dutch Baroque. I mean, of course, phenomenal painters like Rubens, like Rembrandt. We'll have plenty of time to talk about them. I want to focus on the Italian Baroque because it's closer to this ambition of the church and because it's ideologically more coherent. So when we're talking about Carracci, we are talking about usage of light and darkness and contrasts. We're talking about very dramatic depictions, very insisting and poignant paintings, very bold compositions. So this is basically very, very different than the Renaissance. This is all about poise and calm and elegance. So we have all of this present in Caravaggio, only to the nth degree. So Caravaggio is very famous for his chiaroscuro method, where he has these entire beams of light thrown into absolutely profound darkness. We have people who are very brazenly and openly sexual. Caravaggio was a famous Maverick. He was a homosexual, a murderer, a very problematic character, someone whose entire painting style was a reflection of his persona. He was quite infamous as enfant terrible of the world of arts. He painted without sketches. He would just apply paint directly onto canvas, which, if you had anything to do with painting, know that is quite difficult to paint without structure, without order, without composition. So you just go and paint. This is the act of genius, the pure creation. So you could also argue that his paintings are very homoerotic and kind of fun, really, seen from that point of view. And you can argue that some of them, I mean, this is again a very subjective take on things, so you don't have to quote me on this, but they are very kitsch and exaggerated and kind of parodic, kind of hilarious, really. So you can see that he drives his stylization so close to reality that it becomes uncomfortable. And I mean, I can completely understand it within that particular context and why he was doing it and how he was doing it, but still, visually on their own, I find Caravaggio to be a bit too much. Again, this is just a subjective personal take on things. It's by no means an absolute, judgment of its aesthetical value. Now, there's another person that is very interesting in this particular period. This is Artemisia Gentileschi. So she's daughter of a rather well-known painter, and she is one of the rare female painters of this or any other period, really, before the 20th century. So a very talented individual who had this great misfortune, great tragedy happened to her, that she was raped by one of her father's friends. And unlike was the case in that time, she did not want to quietly bear this burden of shame and guilt and everything else that was expected of women back in the day. No, she decided to come forth, and she decided to publicly accuse the man who's done her wrong and to basically run a trial against him. So her father, again, quite unusual for his time, decided to side with his daughter and not with another man. He decided to support her, to explain to the world another thing that was kind of strange for them to understand, that it wasn't a female fault, it wasn't her fault that she got violated, it was actually the fault of the perpetrator. So not only that they made a big public scandal about all of this, and not only that this was one of the milestones in, you might say, female history, she also made a very famous, or rather infamous, painting that was called Judith Decapitating Holofernes. And this is the story from the Bible where Judith is sent to the enemy camp to sleep with an enemy general, and then when he is asleep, she cuts his head off and brings his head back to her own camp. So she does this self-sacrifice, if you will. She sleeps with the enemy so as to drastically incapacitate them, so as to kill an important general who is responsible for the entire battle strategy. So this is seen as an act of self-sacrifice, but it's also seen as a way of fighting the enemy, right? Now, the way she represents this is incredibly vindictive and is very, very powerful. Of course, I will present the image so that you can see it. She, of course, painted herself as Judith, and she, of course, painted her violator as the general that's being decapitated. So this was her revenge, that justice that was denied to her for quite a while in the real life. She took her revenge in the world, in the realm of art, and she depicted decapitation of this person in a fairly unusual manner. So this is where Baroque becomes so interesting, is that if we're looking at the Renaissance paintings, a lot of them, although they picked very brutal acts like the crucifixion, we mentioned that it's the most painful thing a human body can endure, we tend to depict these horrendous, brutal, torturous events in a very calm, harmonious manner. So in many Renaissance paintings, you can see Christ basically sleeping on the cross, which is completely opposite to the very purpose. The whole purpose of the cross is to provoke unimaginable suffering. So depicting Christ that is just chilling on the cross, you can understand it from a stylistical point of view as a sort of aestheticization, but you cannot really understand it in terms of what actually happened. So this particular painter moves away from this idea that we will minimize gore, we will minimize blood, we will depict things as brutal as they are. And so many art critics argued that the blood that was so present in the painting was reminiscent of her own blood that she had to release while she was going through her own agony, being violated by her father's friend. So this is the very brutal, very natural, very visceral depiction of this entire act. And very rarely you get to see this. This is a fairly very unusual and quite striking painting. Now, this fits perfectly with the rest of Baroque because it's all about drama, it's all about elevated pathos. So, while we don't really get very many paintings that are so direct and so brutal and so disturbing, really, and painted with such passion and with such want for vengeance, we do get a similar amount of involvement, we do get a similar amount of pathos, and we do get the similar intensity or sought intensity when it comes to Fauvism. So when you look at Gauguin's paintings, one of the progenitors of Fauvism, you can see that they have a lot of suspended eroticism. So you can see this in the colors he's using. And you can see this in the type of light, very rich, golden, saturated light, immensely saturated colors. You can see this intensity in a lot of Matisse's paintings because he clashes very simple colors. He is seeking power in simplicity. He wants contrasts to match perfectly. So he wants his paintings to be very, very penetrative, to be very impressive, and to be most dramatic. Now, it's not quite as obvious as is the case with some other artists or with some other paintings, but this is truly the case. So we have this whole idea of drama, of pathos being highlighted. You could argue the similar thing with Duran. Duran is another person that clearly shows us the bridge between pointillism and its dry abstraction and its cerebral ways into more passionate, more pathetic, more dramatic Fauvism. So you can see what this opens up the most of the 20th century. This intentional atavism and this primitivism of the sorts explain us many painters that are to come. We have painters who fully embrace this, and although they create in different styles, like analytical cubism or surrealism, this whole idea of atavism, this whole idea that we're going to willfully make ourselves primitive, we're going to devolve, we're going to go back to the status of animality, is something that is quite interesting. Now, if you go back to Baroque, you see a very similar tendency, but there, this passion, this drama is supposed to take us closer to God. It's supposed to represent us, divine nature, as being made of these qualities. And I cannot stress this enough, how impressive and how important and how ambitious this is. Because Baroque tells us of divine nature as being made of contortion and passion and drama and even pain, but very loud, very explosive sentiments, whereas Fauvism tends to do the same only with human nature, approaching the same set of emotions, the same set of states of mind, but giving them to humans rather than divinity. But as we already said, these two come together because God created humans, not to go over that again. So in many ways, these styles are different, but in many other ways, they are very, very similar. And I sought to underline these similarities and make them more apparent. So I'd be curious to hear your opinion on this. I thank you for your attention yet again. Have a nice day and see you soon. Ciao.